Here in the beautiful city of Vienna, there are great traditions of music, and the city has been home to some of the world's greatest composers, not least among whom was Franz Peter Schubert. Although now recognized for his true greatness, Schubert was, in his short life, almost unknown. Foreign commentators on musical life in Vienna at the time didn't even mention him. He was born in this house in the suburb of Himmelpfortgrund. Although only 5 of his parents' 13 children survived, their family life could not have been easy, as not only did they live here, but the father was a schoolteacher, and every day 100 boys in the morning and another 100 in the afternoon crowded into the apartment for lessons. There were 16 apartments, so many families shared this courtyard and its facilities, and the Schubert family had 2 of the upper rooms. It is kept in fine condition today, but with so many people using it, life must have been quite rough here. There were 9 streets and 86 houses in Himmelpfortgrund at the time, and there were more than 3,000 inhabitants. Overcrowding was common throughout Vienna. A city in its prime, however, as capital of the great Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included most of Eastern Europe, extending down even to northern Italy. The rulers of this great empire were wonderfully housed in large and beautiful palaces. The majority of their subjects did not fare so well. When Franz was 4 years old, the family moved to more spacious quarters not far away. In Saulengasse, Schubert's father expanded his school and was able to give his own children an excellent education. The father, a farmer's son from Moravia, had built up his school from almost nothing. He was proud of his success. He himself played the cello for pleasure, so he gave his son Franz music from an early age. Schubert's mother was a locksmith's daughter, also from Moravia. She was quiet and even-tempered, and she bore 11 children, 7 of whom died in infancy. In the nearby Lichtental church, it's about half a mile down the hill, the boy Franz became first soprano in the choir. His father had taught him the violin, and his brother Ignaz taught him the piano. His precocious talent was soon recognized, and the choirmaster was astounded at Schubert's grasp of musical principles and his performing ability. It could be said that though Schubert came from a modest background, he had unusually good teaching, both in general and in musical education from an early age. So the little boy who sang in the church was a rewarding pupil. As befitted the city of Mozart and Haydn, Vienna had a royal court chapel choir of great excellence, housed in these buildings, still renowned today as the Vienna Boys' Choir. It's not surprising to find Schubert being put forward for an audition in 1808, when he was 11. As a member of the choir, he would have the best possible musical education. But along with this came a place in the General Academy or Seminary, called the Imperial and Royal Seminary. It offered the best education to be had in Vienna. Schubert apparently caused a sensation among the musical directors of the court, who included Salieri, with the musicality and sureness of his sight reading, when he performed the music given to him. He got a place, and even when his voice broke a few years later, his academic work was so good he was allowed to continue his education at the seminary. At the Royal Seminary, music was carefully nurtured. There was an orchestra which played a symphony and a couple of overtures every evening. Schubert played the violin in the orchestra, and his musical talent flourished. The pupils at the seminary wore a uniform with breeches, and Schubert probably looked like this. Schubert studied piano and organ with a certain Wenzel Rosiker, who is reported to have said that in his view Schubert's talents came from God. It appears that Salieri, one of the school musical directors, was impressed by a song Schubert wrote and began to teach him counterpoint. This was a signal honor, as Salieri, since the time of Mozart, had been a leading figure in Viennese music. It's not clear how much Schubert got from him, but Salieri apparently introduced him to the study of Gluck's music, which delighted Schubert. For the time being, life in the seminary and singing in the royal chapel formed Schubert's world. But all around in the city of Vienna and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, great disturbances were taking place. The Emperor Franz Joseph I had been crowned in 1792, but ever since then Austria had been involved in wars with the French, and Vienna became a particular target of Napoleon. Napoleon had mesmerized most of Europe at first with his grand designs and stupendous achievements, but just as Beethoven turned from him, so did the rest of the world, as he bullied them and battled against them. He took Vienna in 1805 and again in 1809, the year Schubert joined the seminary. The boys were in school when the French began bombarding the city. The school building was hit by a shell, but no one was hurt. Another shell blew up one of the fountains in the university square in front of the school. The boys wanted to join the student corps, but were forbidden. It was no doubt exciting for them, but terrible for the adult residents of Vienna. Napoleon occupied the imperial palace at Schönbrunn and reviewed his troops. He married the emperor's daughter in 1810, seemingly cementing his dominance of Europe. Fortunately, it didn't last, and in 1813 Napoleon's army was defeated by the combined efforts of the Austrians, the Prussians and the Russians at Leipzig. Austria got back all she had lost. Life settled down in Vienna, and the intelligent middle-class world into which Franz Schubert was to settle flourished again. There were changes in his family. His mother died in 1812 of typhoid fever. Schubert was 15. Shortly afterwards his father married again, a much younger woman. Anna was only 14 years older than Schubert, and they became good friends. At the seminary, Schubert made more good friends. Amongst them was Joseph von Sporn, who, although several years older and a law student, recognized Franz Schubert's gifts at once. He remained a valuable and loyal supporter throughout the composer's life. From Sporn we learn of his early compositions at school, of the sureness of his beat, and of how the otherwise quiet and ordinary-looking boy gave himself up in the most lively way to the impressions of the lovely symphony we were playing. This is reputed to be a likeness of Schubert at the age of 16, and Sporn and his other friends were to ensure we have many memorials of Schubert's life, both at school and afterwards. At the end of 1813, Schubert left the seminary and returned to the crowded family apartment in the Saulengasse. For the academic year of 1813-14, he attended St. Anna's College, a nearby teacher training establishment, and thereafter he worked as a schoolmaster with his father. Schubert had little patience for the job and probably didn't care for it, but at first it seemed the only way for him to live. Apparently more than 300 pupils crowded into the school at the peak of its success. He kept closely in touch with Sporn and his other friends. Johann Meyerhofer was a poet and introduced to Schubert by Sporn. Schubert was to set many of his poems, and the two, although very different in character, were later to share rooms for some time. Meyerhofer was moody and introspective, in contrast to Schubert's outgoing charm. Another new friend was Franz Schubert, whom Schubert was most fond of among all his friends. Schubert was a wealthy dilettante who followed various professions from actor and painter to civil servant at different times. He was charming, unstable, irreligious and frivolous. He appealed to Schubert immensely, and although he was not greatly loved by the other friends, Schubert and Schobert as they called themselves, remained close to the end of Schubert's life. During 1814, his time at the training college and his first taste of teaching, Schubert was composing steadily. He produced, in fact, a torrent of music, a symphony, 6 string quartets, piano pieces, orchestral pieces, and over 50 songs. He could apparently write no matter what was going on around him, and what emerged seemed to need little correction. The German poet Goethe was then at the height of his fame, and Schubert set one of the poems from Goethe's play Faust, Gretchen am Spinnrade, Gretchen at the spinning wheel. It was written in October 1814 when he was 17. There is not much to say about Gretchen except that it is a perfect and stunning example of Schubert's genius. During 1815, Schubert was teaching hundreds of little boys and writing more music, more than 200 works, ranging from songs to symphonies. Amongst the songs was Heidenröslein, Hedge Roses, another Goethe setting, and one of the loveliest songs Schubert wrote. He followed that with The Earl King, Earl König, an amazing tour de force. If an excuse for all this outpouring of music is needed, it is reputed that Schubert was in love with a local girl, Therese Grob, here pictured in later life. Schubert was extremely reticent about such love affairs as he may have had. Maybe Therese was the love of his life. We have little evidence to go by, however, and certainly nothing came of it. For a composer whose greatest success included some wonderful love songs, feelings of the heart must have been of great significance to him. In the autumn of 1816, Schubert gave up schoolmastering and moved to live in Schober's apartment in town. Schober's mother and sister welcomed him, and Schober's cosmopolitan background — he was born in Sweden of German Austrian parents — his wit, his amoral views, and his charming behavior suited Schubert, and contrasted strongly with the rather Puritan world of his own family. Schubert undoubtedly led Schubert into a way of life he might not otherwise have met. Their riotous enjoyment of Vienna's brothels gave Schubert the syphilis which was to hasten the end of his life. But Schubert never ceased to value his friend Schober. Schober wrote the words of An die Musik, to music, one of Schubert's greatest songs, and written this time. It's a wonderful melody, but it's the wholeness of the piano part, the voice part and the words together that make up Schubert's unique achievement. Schubert also drew this cartoon of his friend Schubert and a very tall man called Johann Michael Vogel. Vogel was a high baritone of great distinction at the Vienna Opera. The friends decided that Schubert's wonderful songs needed a singer. When Vogel met Schubert and came to know and love the songs, he couldn't believe that this little man, Schubert was more than a foot shorter than Vogel, could produce such beautiful music. Vogel became the great exponent of Schubert's songs, and the two became close friends. Vogel, like many others, thought that the useful Schubert's music came to him as in a clairvoyant experience. Schubert worked so quickly, wrote with little correction. How could it be otherwise? Sporn, however, would have none of this. He knew Schubert to be a master musician who knew his craft and had studied all the works of Handel, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. There was no trick to it, just genius and hard work. The world of Vienna, particularly after the unsettling scares of Napoleon, had opted with great determination for comfortable romantic bourgeois values. It was an immensely attractive world, and one of which music was an intrinsic part. It seemed nearly everyone sang or played instruments with no little skill. For an aspiring composer, it was a perfect time to be alive. In 1815, while the young Schubert was composing Erlkönig, Vienna was holding its Congress to decide the political fate of the peoples of the empire. The eyes of the world were on it, and native pride, wit and fashion rose to the occasion. As always, church music was a way forward for a composer. Schubert was to struggle unsuccessfully with this medium. The patronage of the princes of the church was still extremely important in music, but religion and Schubert sat uneasily together. The opera, then as now, was at the center of musical life, but light opera, and above all Italian opera, was what people wanted. Schubert went on to write 17 German operas. He worked on no less than 7 in 1815. Only 3 in all reached the stage, and they all failed, due largely to poor librettos. The Kärtner Tor Theatre commissioned an opera from him, and Die Zwillingsbrüder, the twin brothers, was the result, though it wasn't performed until 1820, and then only for 6 performances. In 1818, Schubert was offered a job as music tutor to the 2 young daughters of Count Johann Karl Esterhazy at their Hungarian summer home of Zilic. It got him away from home, and it helped keep him alive. His stay in Zilic also means we have some letters to his friends, in which he reveals much of the charm and liveliness which endeared him to them. This journey to Hungary was as far as Schubert travelled in his life. There was no one there who had much feeling for art, except, he suspected, the Countess, and he missed the company of his friends. Back in Vienna in 1819, Schubert went off for the first of several holidays with his friend, the singer Vogel. At Vogel's expense, they went to Steyr, Vogel's birthplace, and a charming town about 90 miles west of Vienna. On this visit they met the musical patron of the town, Sylvester Baumgartner, who immediately commissioned Schubert to write a chamber work they could perform. The result was the charming piano quartet called The Trout, because it uses the theme from the song of that name, Die Forelle. Holidays with Vogel became almost a regular affair in Schubert's life. Gmunden was another town they visited, and Schubert particularly enjoyed walks in the surrounding countryside. At Gmunden they stayed with a family who had a house on the lake. On these trips, Vogel and Schubert, of course, gave recitals of his songs. Schubert went twice with his friend Schober to a family home at Atzenbruck. There were endless parties with the friends, dancing for which Schubert had to play his waltzes, and eating and drinking to all hours. Amongst the new friends was the artist Kuppelweiser, who brilliantly recorded events. This drawing shows the bespectacled Schubert watching an excursion party set off. If ever there was a representation of the Romantic age, this is it. In this lovely watercolor, Schubert is at the piano and the artist himself sits behind it. The rest of the group are involved in party games. This is a game of ball, also at Atzenbruck Castle. The landscape was done by the ever-talented Schober, and the figures put in by another artist friend, Schwint. Schubert smokes a long pipe. The handsome Moritz von Schwint was only 18 when he joined the Schubert circle. He could compose almost as well as he could paint. He went on to draw Schubert and his friends frequently, and in later years became one of Germany's greatest painters. Kuppelweiser painted and drew Schubert also, and this sketch was done in 1821 when Schubert was 23. Schwint did this drawing of a typical Schubert evening, or Schubertiad as they were called in 1868, long after the composer's death. Vogel is about to sing, and Schubert is of course at the keyboard. All the other friends are portrayed here, the ever-faithful Sporn, Schober, Schwint himself, and on the wall Countess Caroline Esterhazy. In 1824, Schubert returned to Hungary to teach the Esterhazy girls, and Countess Caroline was 19 and very pretty. It is thought that this time he fell in love with her. Certainly he dedicated a beautiful piano duet to her. By this time he knew he had the fatal disease syphilis, and he knew therefore that marriage could not be for him, quite apart from the social divide that separated him from a countess. His friends paid to have his first works engraved, and they were sold at the shop of the music publisher Anton Diabelli, one of the most important Viennese publishers. This brought Schubert much needed income, and Diabelli and others began to publish his songs and other works. Generally, however, Schubert was useless at organizing his finances, and indeed most other aspects of living. Schubert contrived to live in his own unique and irregular style for the rest of his days. After a late arising came a morning's intense composition. In the late afternoon he'd take a stroll with some friends over to Grinzing or some other leafy suburb, where they would linger over a glass of wine. In the evening after supper and a Schubertiad at someone's house, they would go on to a coffee shop like the King of Hungary and talk and laugh until well past midnight. In the winter of 1827, Schubert began one of his greatest works, the song cycle Die Winterreise, or The Winter's Journey. It was based on the poems of Robert Müller, not so stunning on their own, but when set by Schubert into this glorious group of songs, the whole becomes quite magical. He had been living since March of this year in the Schubert's new lodging in the Tachlauben. Here he had spacious accommodation, 2 rooms and a music closet. This was to be his base for the rest of his life. This building is all that remains of the period. Typically, Schubert invited everyone for a housewarming party, forgot all about it and didn't appear. On 26th March, Beethoven died. They had met only once, but Schubert was nervous on the occasion, and they never met again. Beethoven was astounded by the quality of Schubert's songs, and Schubert had dedicated a piano duet to him. Schubert was one of 36 torchbearers at the funeral. Gradually his works were published and concerts were given, but in the eyes of the public he was a songwriter and therefore not serious. When he got serious, no one could understand his music. Above all, he was quite unprepossessing in appearance, and although he played well, he was not a virtuoso pianist like Mozart or Beethoven. Could he possibly be a success? It was all disheartening. On a holiday trip to Graz with a friend, however, they stayed at the home of Marie Pachler. The Pachler family were accomplished musicians and held frequent Schubertiades. They were a typical part of the network of friends drawn together by Schubert's music and his unique personality, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about his life. Worldly success he may not have had, but he was never without friends who valued and understood him. In 1828 he was incredibly busy. He wrote the great C major symphony and the string quartet in C major, and he had already written the unfinished symphony, which was to command worldwide popularity. His chamber works were performed by the best quartet in Vienna, led by Ignaz Schuppanzich, longtime exponent of Beethoven. It couldn't be said that Schubert lacked encouragement from the best quarters. But popular success, such as his works enjoy today, he did not have. In 1828 he began to feel the onset of the second stage of syphilis, headaches, giddiness and nausea. It was depressing. In spite of that, he wrote in this, the last year of his life, an astonishing number of works, including several religious works, which he hoped yet again would gain him public support. On the 1st of September 1828, Schubert left his apartment and went to stay with his brother Ferdinand in the suburb of Neuwieden. He obviously meant to make only a short visit, for he left his manuscripts behind at Schubert. He was ill and felt the country air would help him. 2 months later, he was still there and not much better. Suddenly he was struck down with a new illness, typhoid fever, the illness which had killed his mother and which at this time was generally fatal. In his already weak condition, he did not last long and died on November 19th, aged not quite 32. In his brief life, Schubert wrote a phenomenal amount of beautiful music. We can regret that he never experienced the great recognition his work today enjoys, but no man was better loved and valued by his friends than Franz Peter Schubert, which is enough reward for anyone.